Well, my friends, things are getting rather interesting here again. One country has recently been exposed by other regional powers in the Middle East in numerous plots to destabilize the region, to make its neighbors look bad, and effectively to cast an entire religion as violent extremists. It is something that has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands in the region through indirect funding and arms, and it is sought for over 20 years to enact a plan for Middle Eastern supremacy. And no, my friends, I can already probably guess what I'm going to be seeing here in the comment section, but no, we are not talking about a certain country that Jesus comes from. Instead, we are talking about the United Arab Emirates, and the fact that their 20-year plan for regional hegemony has just been uncovered and exposed for much of the wide world to actually see. This is something that has more than pissed off the bigger regional players and has wider implications, much wider than what most people realize. And so today, what it is that we're going to be doing is we're going to be diving deeper into the story. But first, we're going to need to get some context so you'll understand what I'm talking about. Now, to ever so briefly catch up those who aren't exactly familiar with the country, we're going to be touching on the UAE as it's commonly called and its more modern history, which again is something that a lot of people aren't really familiar with. So we first need to go back by around 130,000 years ago when, no, no, I'm just playing. But hey, I could have. I could have done it. We're not doing that today, but I could have. But my friends, before it is that we continue with today's story, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, Aura. Which is very important, mind you, because I'm sure that for any of you who are watching this right now, any denizens of the internet, you're probably wondering, why the heck is it that I keep on getting flooded with spam calls and emails and things like that? And the answer is because your information is being sold by data brokers out there online. That is why I recommend today's sponsor, Aura, to my friends, followers, and family, because they actually take care of the hard part, automatically removing your info from these sites and keeping it off. Because the thing is, Aura is so much more than just a digital security service. You get alerts if your personal info is found on the dark web, you get real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, 24/7 monitoring to help keep your identity secure, a secure VPN, antivirus, password manager, and more, as well as US-based support available around the clock if something goes wrong. If something does go wrong somehow, you have up to $5 million in identity theft protection from Aura. So yeah, you're kind of covered. Seriously, there are so many bad actors out there on the internet, and considering how many people I have had that have made threats against me, my friends, my family, and more because of what it is that I do, I cannot let myself be vulnerable, and honestly, you should not either. Make sure to go to my link down in the description and try Aura for free for 14 days. Go to aura.com/history-of-everything, and just by trying it out, you can see for the first 14 days whether or not your data is out there on the internet. Please be safe, my friends. If there is anything that we have shown, the world is a dangerous and very complex place. More seriously, though, as is the case with many Middle Eastern countries, the United Arab Emirates really came into existence as we know it following the effects of World War I. Starting out as initially just a region known as the Trucial States to the Westerners, this expansive desert down in the corner of the Persian Gulf is situated between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and was the home and territory of 9 sheiks that were ruling territories with frequent disputes and constantly shifting boundaries. But during the war, an oil drilling company that would later become British Petroleum, known these days as BP, found out that there was oil to be found all around this place and beneath the Persian Gulf. And suddenly, the British were watching the sheiks' careers with great interest. So, they went and offered the sheiks treaties of protection, and the lands of the sheiks became British protectorate for the next half century. From there, then, in late 1972, they would obtain their independence from the British government and officially become known as the United Arab Emirates. Now, this wasn't any kind of revolution or anything like that. The British simply pulled out of the region once their half-century treaties had ended, and let it be known they didn't intend to provide any further protection. They had seen this day coming. Still, independence is independence, so that's something. You can chalk it up to the list of the number of countries that celebrate their independence from Britain every year. And hey, interesting side note. Initially, the UAE was supposed to include the lands of 2 additional sheiks in a larger group formed in the late 1960s called the Federation of Arab Emirates, but at a massively consequential and disastrous meeting between members in October of 1969, 2 of the sheiks got majorly pissed off when a British government representative made comments to the group of sheiks stating that Britain was excited to do business with them going forward. The 2 offended sheiks thought that this was a bad sign of the future for foreign intervention in national affairs, and they pulled out of the union entirely, then and there. These 2 sheiks decided that They would just see how it went on their own. And that is actually how the world said hello to the two countries of Qatar and Bahrain. So yeah, those could have been just one country, and now they're not. Funny story. Anyway, each of these territories is called an emirate, and typically the leader of an emirate would be called the emir. But the UAE decided to use the term sheikh in accordance with Arabic tribal tradition. These seven emirates are Fujairah, Sharjah, Ajman, Ras Al Khaimah, Al Quwan, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi. Which I'm probably butchering the name on a number of those here. I do apologize, but some of the names are things that you are probably very familiar with. The Emirate of Dubai is the most populous emirate, with 35% of the entire UAE population, and it is also where much of the international focus for the UAE really is focused on. Not really sure how else I should say that there. Besides that, the Emirate of Abu Dhabi has 31%, meaning that between the two of them, two-thirds of the entire UAE population lives in either Abu Dhabi or Dubai. Abu Dhabi is by far the largest emirate, though, comprising of over 26,000 square miles, or nearly 87% of the entire country's landmass. But Dubai is, as I said, the far more famous one these days because of its massive engineering projects. But excluding the artificial islands that they've created, Dubai only accounts for just 5% of the UAE's total landmass. It's also the Emirates' largest city, so that's something. In the last 30 years, the Emirates have been on incredible public relations benders, trying to push and cast themselves as the desert oasis of the world. Something where they are not only this shining example of civilization in the desert, but rather a playland for many of the world's richest, most powerful, and beautiful people, arguably. They did so by erecting massive infrastructure megaprojects on a scale that literally no one else but maybe perhaps China has been able to accomplish. And what's even more impressive is that when they started as a country in 1972, they started with almost nothing as far as a government and infrastructure goes. The government had no ministries, no formal offices, no national infrastructure. They had no major roads, education, finance, telecom. They didn't even really have a shared currency. But that wasn't going to last long. They immediately got to work, and by the time the 2010s hit, they had built some of the world's most impressive mega projects, including the Palm Jumeirah, the World Islands, and the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa, which stands at a nose-bleeding inducing 830 meters or 2,722 feet. That is half a mile of building going straight up, which, though it looks impressive, I'll be honest, a lot of the big buildings when you see here for mega projects are practically half useless. But still, big building, looks cool, GDP go up. Yeah, it's going to be a thing that we're going to talk about here later at some point. Aside from setting engineering records, though, the UAE really began to develop another plan in the early 2010s. After it was discovered that some of the plotters of the 9/11 terror attacks had been funded through banks in the UAE, the country had quickly turned over those responsible, and in 2006, they signed a defense agreement with the United States, primarily for protection against Iran, which, those of you familiar with what I've been talking about here, is remarkably aggressive, especially utilizing proxy states and proxy forces. And if you're curious about how they built all these mega projects, it's easy when you don't really care that much about, the amount of human suffering you cause. The Wikipedia page for human rights violations by the UAE is shockingly long and detailed, and honestly gives a lot more that we could really go on to make a whole other video. So let us know in the comment section below if you'd like to see that, because that is another beast that we probably need to tackle. But either way, right now, we just at this point are referring to the rights violations involving mega projects. I'm going to try and summarize here when I say that they let a lot of people immigrate from various Asian and African countries, and then brutally mistreated them with long hours, dangerous conditions, beatings, withheld pay, lacking days off, and physical and psychological abuse. A lot of stuff. In many cases, they would simply just take their passports away from them so that they couldn't leave the country, turning them into kinds of wage slaves if they even got their wages in the first place. This is a country that has no guaranteed freedom of speech or freedom of the press, and whose laws incorporate elements of Sharia law. This was terrible for foreign migrant workers because, at the time, the country was operating under the kafala system. The kafala system ties migrant workers to their employers who act as their sponsors, and this makes it difficult for them to change employers. So, if a domestic worker attempts to leave her sponsor before the end of her contract without their sponsor's approval, he or she will be typically deemed to have absconded, which usually results in fines and deportation if their sponsor even allows them to leave. They changed the law when it came to most workers, but if you're a domestic worker, like a maid or a nanny or something like that, in a place where women don't really have that many protections, you can still be working under the kafala system to this day. It's wild. And now, these things wouldn't be so big of a problem if the UAE had anywhere near a normal population distribution. But the reason that I bring up women regarding this is that here's the thing, this is one of the most, if not the most, lopsided population distribution on the planet. 80% of the UAE's population is comprised of these foreign migrant workers, who account for 90% of the country's workforce. 43% of the migrant worker population comes from India alone. But no matter where you hail from, if you're a migrant worker in the UAE, you're almost guaranteed to live a miserable existence. Human trafficking and prostitution are also dangerous for migrant workers, and the country just had a very dark history with those it imports to build its giant monuments. But unfortunately, their push to turn Dubai into an engineering wonderland isn't the only grand plan that the United Arab Emirates had in mind. And that, my friends, brings us to the crux of the video, the big thing that we've been trying to focus on. For the last 15 years or so, the UAE has been making various moves to gather more power and influence in the Middle East and Africa. And they did it right under the eyes of the rest of the world, which I will need to explain how. The primary way that their plan went into effect was through the funding of Islamic extremist and separatist groups throughout the greater worldwide Muslim community. Now, we're going to briefly touch on each major place and group that the UAE has been funding and why. And so, for that, first we need to start in Libya. In response to Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi being deposed and killed, the UAE would take advantage of the access that it was granted by being part of the international force that removed Gaddafi from power. But with the Arab Spring occurring shortly afterward, the UAE grew alarmed at the pace of the uprisings and saw its chances for regional power and influence dwindling, and that was not something it wanted. If any country in the Muslim world hated what happened during the Arab Spring and the popular uprisings that were taking place, with everything it stood for, that's probably going to be the UAE at the top of the list. This is something that could greatly destabilize their efforts for influence, prestige, power, and control. And that is something that I would need to clarify here, because we're talking about something that is both ideological as well as heavily economic. In the eyes of the sheiks, they are the new merchants of a neo-Silk Road. They want to control what goes through the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, parts of the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa, everything. Heading east, they try to influence everything short of India and China. And in this regard, it is almost natural that their biggest rival regarding power and influence would be Turkey, which, for those of you who are familiar with some of the controversies occurring within NATO and Turkey over the past several decades, or I say several decades, within the last decade to be more precise, it's not exactly all that great. But both countries vie for power, influence, and greater business ties throughout the region, and both seek to benefit from Libya's massive reserves of oil and natural gas. Helping to rebuild war-torn infrastructure gave the UAE its first exposure to what it really wants in Libya: gold. Experts believe that in recent years, 55 tons of Libyan gold was smuggled into the UAE, which would cause it to become the most sought-after place in the world to conduct international money laundering. In the year 2014, Libyan military general Khalifa Haftar began his push to take control of the country with its formation of the Libyan National Army. Soon, the UAE found its ally in Libya, and they began to support Haftar and his forces, sending them money, drones, fighter jets, and more. The UAE even built an airbase near the northeastern Libyan city of Marj. And while they were pouring in supplies and equipment, they were also removing gold at the same time. For Haftar, the support was a godsend. When he tried to take Tripoli and the attack failed, other supporters like Russia and Egypt saw weakness and they pulled their support. But the UAE still considered him useful for their goals, though, and would continue to support him. This conflict would see one of the first major times where the UAE and Turkey would be at odds for regional influence. And if it wasn't for Turkish intervention, Haftar arguably would have taken over all of Libya. As the situation stands, he now controls the eastern half of Libya, but the conflict is still something that technically rages on. Next, from there, we have to travel to Sudan, where the UAE's funding and support may have possibly caused the greatest suffering and loss of life, as we've previously covered in one of our videos on Sudan that probably we need to go back there here again. The UAE has been financing and arming the RSF, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known largely as Hemedi in the world, and one of the two main parties in Sudan's civil war. This includes funneling weapons to the Darfur based group under the guise of humanitarian aid operations for displaced Sudanese in Chad. It is also, again, fixated on Sudan's gold, just like it did in Libya. In 2012, gold made up 60% of the country's exports. And since 2014, a Dubai registered joint Russian Emirati company, Emiral Resources, has been one of the major players in Sudan's gold mining sector. In that same year, gold deposits were discovered in Jebel Amer in northern Darfur, Hemedi's backyard, basically. And from that, he made sure that he got a cut of the profits from the mines there. This would make Hemedi a very rich man and would bring even more gold back to Dubai. Hemedi and his family would get a full one-third of the gold profits mined in Darfur, an agreement that must work well for him since he doesn't actually have to commit anything other than protection to the mining companies. The importance of this arrangement was clearly shown in 2023 when a new civil war erupted and Hemedi and his RSF militia would split off from the Sudanese armed forces in an attempt to take over the country. The very first thing that the RSF did after the split was official was to quickly go and capture and control as many gold mines and refineries as they possibly could. Another main reason that they supported the RSF and Hemedi is because the war in Sudan right now is effectively one giant proxy war, with numerous countries all involved, each with their own motivations. In Sudan, the choice of who to support was made pretty easy due to the Sudanese armed forces being primarily supported by the UAE's biggest rival, Saudi Arabia. Previously, the two countries had been allies, yes, but over the last decade, it has become increasingly obvious that each of these countries wants the same thing: to be the greatest influence, to be the greatest regional hegemon of the Middle East and North Africa. So, what has all of this funding bought them then, you may wonder? Well, we're not going to sugarcoat it. The UAE has probably made the largest amount of mistakes in Sudan. They have funded and armed the RSF, who were formerly the Janjaweed, which, remember hearing about Darfur back in 2005? Yeah, the genocide that happened there was at the hands of the Janjaweed and Hemedi. And unfortunately, this funding of the Janjaweed, rebranded years ago as the RSF, has allowed them to commit an entirely different genocide in late 2025. The worst of the chaos has been in the Darfur region, again, and mostly focused around the large population center of El Fasher. During late 2025, the RSF would raid Darfur and El Fasher repeatedly until the city's defenses would break. Then they began going door to door, exterminating people for any reason they thought felt right. This would lead to unchecked ethnic cleansing and the systematic murder of over 15,000 members of the Masalit tribe alone, and the deaths of nearly 150,000 people overall in and around El Fasher over the course of just an 18-month siege. What about the UAE then? Well, here's the thing. At the beginning of this conflict, the UAE set up what was supposed to be a hospital in eastern Chad to help treat Sudanese war refugees. In fact, they were using it as a base to transport weapons to the RSF. To show just how much they really don't care about basic decency, it seems, they sent the weapons in boxes that were marked for humanitarian aid. Yeah, that's right. They smuggled in weapons to commit war crimes inside boxes that were literally labeled for humanitarian aid supplies. Like, what they were doing was not just against international law, it was a generally very shitty thing in general. Countless women were attacked and taken advantage of, causing an insane estimate that every other Sudanese woman, a whopping 50%, has been the victim of intimate violations, we will say. Children have been shot and thrown in piles. Meanwhile, the UAE would set about on a press campaign showing boxes marked humanitarian aid flying into Sudan, making them look like good guys. They would spend millions of dollars on public relations campaigns to blame all the atrocities on the Sudanese armed forces. Back in El Fasher, children as young as 1 year old were being subject to horrific crimes. That is how widespread intimate violence was since 2023 in Sudan. They were using these acts as another tool of war and intimidation, and most of the weapons and funding was specifically coming from the UAE. I will be blunt with you here, my friends. We are quite frequently asked what is the worst time and place to be alive in history, but we are rarely asked what that place would be in the present. And the number one contender right now really seems to be Sudan, specifically around El Fasher, where you could be killed or worse merely for answering the door and being in the wrong tribe. If you're a woman or child, it's even worse. If you're a man, the RSF could just shoot you. The situation has gotten as bad or worse than it was in Rwanda in the 90s. Moving on then from Sudan, we come to Somalia, where the UAE is arguably flexing not only its financial muscles, but some of its greatest political influence as well. By funding the development of numerous infrastructure projects, including crucial ports, the UAE gained favor with numerous port cities in multiple parts of Somalia. The trouble here, though, for anyone who has seen my videos on Somalia, is that this country is really more like four separate countries or kids in a giant trench coat pretending to be a country. Each kid is its own sovereign region in its own mind, and none of the kids really like each other very much. Somaliland claims to be independent. Puntland has been given some self governing autonomy, but considers itself its own country too. Jubaland just wanted security and political support from other sources, but didn't exactly claim sovereignty. And then actual Somalia, the southern half that contains Mogadishu, that claims sovereignty over all the others as breakaway regions who need to be brought back into the fold, but they can't really do much. So, unfortunately, Somalia currently operates like if the United States all of a sudden seceded from the federal government. Like, each state would feel like its own country. Each of these Somalian regions all feel differently about the situation and whether they are part of a greater Somalia or not. But the UAE, the reason they are involved is that they have mastered the art of playing all sides concurrently here for the most part in the last decade, and they used this in order to be able to hide Yemeni separatist fighters, but also to transport both arms and personnel into or out of Africa. In other words, Somalia is important to them for reasons like controlling access is to the Red Sea. Overall, though, the main problem with the UAE is that they're willing to do business here with everyone. In January of 2026, Somalia would cut off all ties and agreements with the UAE after its consistent meddling. Since they're supporting all sides, except the actual Somalia by this point, the UAE has effectively been destabilizing Somalia overall by doing so. And it was right under the Saudis' noses that they were doing this. They even turned Egypt from being an ally into something closer to an enemy after their actions in Somalia caused Ethiopia to pursue its own desire to control the Red Sea and dispute water rights of the Nile with Egypt. I say control the Red Sea, it's more like control a port within the Red Sea so that they have the ability to trade, even though they are a landlocked nation. But that, my friends, then brings us to arguably the biggest piece of this entire story. The focus where when people are talking about disastrous conflicts and meddling, this is the current greatest example, Yemen, where everything for the UAE began to crumble rapidly. Saudi frustration with Emirati activities would grow steadily over the year. Despite Saudi Arabia and the UAE's strategic partnership, the former would increasingly view the latter's assertive foreign policy, especially support for non state and separatist actors in Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen, as being a key source of instability. But a critical new factor to explain Riyadh's shift is that Saudi Arabia now sees Israel as a major driver of regional instability and a direct security concern, something almost level with Iran in terms of perceived threat. And because the UAE and Israel have been deepening their partnership, the Saudis continue to be more and more nervous about the UAE's intention. This came to a head recently in the dust up regarding what was just occurring in Yemen, and I'm going to need to explain that. Within Yemen, the Saudi Emirati rivalry would assume a proxy war dimension between militias supported by Saudi Arabia under the command of the internationally recognized Yemeni government, the Presidential Leadership Council, or PLC, and then groups backed by the UAE, including the Southern Transitional Council, STC. Along with this, you had the Houthis, which were their own kind of nightmare for world peace as they have been wreaking havoc upon international shipping. But between these three separate entities, Yemen was effectively split and in a kind of stalemate for the longest time where neither one could get the other to budge. But in December of 2025, in a move that no one expected to actually work or even happen in the first place, the STC managed to rapidly conquer the Hadramaut and Maha governorates that border Saudi Arabia. It was a lightning offensive that at the time that this was going down, people predicted the fall of the Yemeni government, that it was over. But By mid January of 2026, these forces were beaten back by PLC forces, and the STC, at least on paper, from what was announced by Saudi Arabia, the faction led by Adaris al Zubaydi was disbanded. We'll probably need to cover that a little bit more in detail in another time. But in short, from this, the UAE's plans to control strategic cities along Yemen's southern coast in order to project power around the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea was now going up in smoke. Specifically, its most important goal was to control the Bab al Mandab waterway, the entrance to the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean. This is something that if the STC had achieved its goal of getting a Arab southern breakaway state as they wanted, this would be heavily under the thumb of the UAE. But that's probably not going to happen now. Although Saudi Arabia and the UAE intervened as partners in 2015, the two countries diverged in other ambitions. The Saudis would lend their aid and support to the government of then President Andrab Mansur Hadi and the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated Islah Party. On the other hand, Abu Dhabi would go in turn to forming militias as an alternative way to further its interests. To that end, the UAE would go and import and fund fighters from Sudan's Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, to assist its proxies in Yemen. Yeah, that's right. The UAE actually Amazon Prime overnight shipped Sudanese war crime specialists to fight in Yemen like you or I might, order a new shower curtain. And this isn't just some form of speculation or anything like that either. No, the RSF involvement in Yemen was confirmed way back in 2017 when the militia's leader, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemedi, as I said, admitted to losing several hundred soldiers fighting the Houthis there. More recently, reports from the United Nations and international watchdog groups would confirm this as well. But that was just a prelude to what they had attempted recently in December of 2025. And this is going to need a little bit more detail because I skipped over it quite a bit. This consisted of an attempt by the UAE-backed STC to consolidate control over southern Yemen in late 2025 and advance a project of southern secession. And the political fallout over this would prove to be the final collapse in Saudi Emirati collaboration over Yemen. The STC had long sought to reverse Yemen's 1990 unification and restore an independent southern state. However, its military conquest of strategic provinces like Hadramaut and Al-Mara in December would drive Saudi Arabia to intervene directly. Saudi airstrikes would target STC positions, and Riyadh would go and deploy Yemeni and Saudi troops along its southern border with Hadramaut. Saudi Arabia would also publicly accuse the UAE of undermining coalition cooperation while asking the Yemeni government to formally demand the UAE forces leave Yemen within 24 hours. Now, the UAE would immediately announce its withdrawal of forces from Yemen. It would do this because a line had been drawn in the sand by the Saudis, and they weren't able to cross it. They had firmly told the UAE, in no uncertain terms, that they wouldn't be putting up with their crap anymore. Things were about to get very rough for them. At the start of 2026, nearly every major Emirati project abroad began to unravel, oftentimes simultaneously, and from that, violently. In Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces began to lose momentum. In Yemen, the Southern Transitional Council would fully collapse under the Saudi-backed counteroffensive. In Somalia, Somaliland found itself isolated politically. In Libya, Khalifa Haftar was abruptly reminded how fragile positions were. Even worse, they aligned more countries in the region to take a firm stance against them. How did they do that? That, my friends, is the reason for the title of this video, and we'll get to that here in a second. But first, we have to answer the question that many of you may have in this right now: why are they doing this? To explain that, the UAE's economy is deeply dependent on stability beyond its borders. Its ports, its airlines, financial sector, energy exports, all of these things rely on uninterrupted trade flows, especially through choke points like the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Eastern Mediterranean. They found someone they could use in each region they wanted to project power into and influence, and in return, they could gain access to ports, airfields, intelligence, and leverage over others. But they rarely sent their own soldiers. Instead, they were trying to gain power without investing it too much, and it worked for a few years because nobody really pushed back against these efforts hard enough. Minimum investment, maximum influence. This was because they were creating chaos by funding those enacting it. And then, something unique occurred that you wouldn't really expect to change things. The October 7th attacks on Israel occurred. Before October 7th, 2023, the Middle East was quietly moving towards what you would call normalization. Israel had formalized relations with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. Saudi Arabia appeared to be next in line. a development that would have reshaped the region's diplomatic map entirely and something that would have helped create peace. But then the attacks happened. And what would come as a result of that was a multi year grinding effort against insurgency. That from that, regardless of how it is that you feel, and I know there will be strong things that are said in the comment section here below, it is a messy affair. It really is. And regardless of how it is that you feel about it, whether you are pro Israel, anti Israel, anything like that, the thing that you really need to understand is that in relation to international views and in relation to how things are viewed in the Middle East, Israel's response to the attack was prolonged and grinding. Even if justified, it ruined much of their view in the Muslim world. And that is something, arguably, that was a primary goal of Hamas, and from that, Iran, which backed them. It also became bolder, invading into the territories of Lebanon and Syria, something that again angered much of the Muslim world. Then, when Israel went and carried out an airstrike on Hamas leadership on Qatari soil in June of 2025, that was something that for many Muslims across the Middle East and their governments, that was something that could not be tolerated at all. For those of you wondering why Hamas was there in the first place, it's a very simple thing. Previously, this had been allowed as part of a framework of mediation. In other words, Qatar let them live there as long as they didn't conduct any military activities on their soil, but it also allowed a key channel of communication with Hamas leadership that wouldn't just go underground after making a massive strike. This single airstrike caused massive outrage in the Muslim world. The line of thinking was if Israel can attack Qatar without any repercussions whatsoever, then anyone in the Middle East could be next. Whether or not they are justified and trying to take out these forces is besides the question. It's a matter of international relations at that point. The UAE publicly condemned the attack, but privately it actually strengthened its ties with Israel. This was done by deepened intelligence cooperation. Emirati bases being secretly linked to Israeli operational planning, the acceleration of joint defense projects, and Israeli personnel being given access to Emirati facilities in Yemen. So, essentially, the UAE basically went full send on supporting Israel when they should have probably thought about how to take a step back for a second and not be caught up in something more negative for publicity. This timing could not have been worse. Everything in all the countries the UAE had been funding was built up to 1 month, December of 2025. And for a brief moment in time, if you want to say high risk, high reward, for a brief point, it looked like all their plans were going to magically pay off like that. They would have a new South Yemen in their pocket. Half of Sudan was already controlled by Hemedi at this point, and he was fully compliant. Their support and mediation caused Israel to officially recognize Somaliland as a sovereign state right after Christmas. And Libya continued to be a glorified bank for them, continually pumping out oil and gold under a compliant Khalifa Haftar. But then reality hit, and it hit hard. And seemingly all at once, the Emiratis would suffer losses on basically every single front. What had happened was that the UAE, not necessarily on its own, of course, but still being a large factor, managed to help ruin this century's best possible chance at peace in the Middle East, at least for a while. At the same time, three countries came together and all realized the same thing. The balance of power had shifted significantly, and it was time to push back. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, three countries that have disagreed numerous times with each other, all saw the greater threat of an allied UAE Israeli partnership forming, and they decided to act. First, they brought in Qatar, and together they leaned hard in the Arabic world against the recognition of a sovereign Somaliland. This worked so well that not only did Ethiopia pull its support from Somaliland itself, but even the UAE had to pull its plan to recognize a sovereign Somaliland because of the political blowback. It was too intense. Suddenly, Somaliland, which has been trying to do this for years and finally seemed to be on the precipice of full recognized independence, stood alone, and the UAE lost most of its future ambitions in the region. When it came to Libya, Egypt said, "I got this. Send my boy Haftar into office." And the general was summoned at once to a meeting in Cairo. Why would he go? Well, this is because he's being supported by Egypt in literally every capacity for far longer than he had ever been used by the UAE for gold and oil. So, as the story goes, he was not invited, he was summoned to be there. It can't be read as anything less than cowardly that instead of showing up himself, he sent his son, Saddam Haftar, to bear the brunt of the heat. And even worse, for his son, the combined delegation told him to tell his father, in no uncertain terms, that he only exists and breathes today and has any power and leadership in his own country because they've allowed it to be funded. They told him they had uncovered proof that Libya had allowed Colombian and Venezuelan mercenaries to be moved through Libya into Sudan to join the RSF. They provided proof that he had smuggled fuel and weapons into Sudan to the RSF at the request of the Emiratis. Even scarier for the Haftars, Egyptian military officials then shared intelligence with Stam Haftar, outlining Emirati plans to fragment Haftar's territory once the RSF secured control over Darfur and Kordofan and had destabilized SAF held northern Sudan. If he didn't believe that they were being serious, Egypt arranged it so just as he was being told to cut the shit, Libyan supply trucks headed to the RSF got hit with a precision airstrike. Dozens of vehicles carrying fuel, weapons, supplies, ammo, and more were destroyed and burned to the ground. They weren't playing. Saddam Haftar returned to his father to report on how the meeting went. Essentially, they were not going to be a useful pawn for the UAE anymore. The airstrike on the RSF supply line slowed down their momentum so much that their hard push to try and take over the country stalled out shortly after the fall of El Fasher. Expansion doesn't really look likely for them, and it's going to be too risky to try and get gold out to the UAE with so many eyes on them now. Egypt and Turkey also shut down the airspace over Sudan so that the UAE couldn't fly in supplies either, labeled as humanitarian aid. Their connections to the RSF were mostly severed by this. Then, the worst possible thing the UAE could imagine happened. They created so many enemies that their enemies decided to team up. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, I guess. Let me explain. In the past month, numerous meetings and talks have occurred about the formation of a strategic military alliance between powerful regional forces that had previously kept each other at a safe distance. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, and Pakistan are all in talks to form what has been called by some, unofficially, the Islamic NATO. This would be a military treaty of some type that would mirror Article 5 portions of NATO's charter and dictates that an attack on one member equates to an attack on all members. That would combine the nuclear deterrence of Pakistan, the advanced technology and military power of the Turkish military, the funding of the Qataris and the Saudis, and the regional clout of Egypt, as well as its competent air force. This would also include countries with a population larger than that of countries within the European Union. And it would be a massive bulwark against any potential Emirati-Israeli expansion and influence. Alas, the early reports proved to be a bit over-optimistic when talking about this, but the important part is that these countries, which have been vastly either at each other's throats or have different views based off ideologies, they now have a shared interest, and that is to rein in the UAE. So even if they don't end up making an Islamic NATO, they're going to still work together with a common goal. They're still sharing information and helping each other to keep an eye on their common adversary that was once their ally, and it looks like these new ties may continue to grow. But the status quo has definitely changed in the Middle East. If the Emiratis had decided to ally with Saudi Arabia, they could have presented a strong united front, and the area would have pretty much continued with business as usual, with everyone being concerned with either Israel or Iran. They could have put more pressure on either Israel or Gaza to help end the war and usher in an era of peace in a more united Muslim world, but they didn't, and their plans arguably blew up in their face. So now, the conflicts will likely continue in the region, and the dream of peace in the Middle East is likely to be pushed another generation into the future, if it is ever something that could ever actually happen, though the chances of that are low in the first place. Either way, my friends, we'll be sure to update you if anything major changes, but that's pretty much the whole story. Thank you all for watching, and please, by all means, go check out Patreon, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.